This is TWiT.
Google, so we missed this last week, and then I did This Week in Google the day later, and I was like, how did this not end up in the show? Because it's actually really interesting. Google has plans.
It's super interesting, but it's not Android specific, though. I do think it's interesting because of what we do and what we are, but it's not really Android. But
well, they make some comments that allude to apps, but
it's adjacent. It's adjacent, but yes, let's talk about
adjacent. Yes, it's Android adjacent.
Android adjacent.
Not Jason. Android adjacent. Google has plans to change its podcast strategy. If you haven't read it by now, Pacific Content has published a 5-part series that dives into
a podcast network, by the way.
All of this in detail. Thank you for that one. I'll have to look up what shows they're doing. To be separate from Google Play Music's podcast feature. So right now in Google Play Music, we have the podcast feature. I don't use it. I use Pocket Casts.
I don't use it.
No.
Pocket Casts all the way.
Yeah.
Pocket Casts.
And I feel like to some degree, like, okay, great. It's nice that Google has an official podcast offering of some sort, but it's really kind of underwhelming. There's no video capability. It's in Play Music, which who would think to look into something called Play Music to find it? I guess it's audio, so that's probably why they put it there. But it feels like hidden. It feels not that easily accessible.
Hey guys, don't forget to go to the iTunes store right after this and make sure to leave a review, because that really helps us get some visibility so people can find this podcast.
That's true, because what is it, like 80% of podcast listenership comes from iOS devices, and Google realized this, and so now they're planning to kind of focus a little bit more on their strategy. They say making podcasts in search a first-class citizen, in the sense that when you search for podcasts, those would be embedded in your search results.
Like a card.
Yeah.
Like a card in the search results.
Yeah, exactly. And and actually, they're working out ways to pick apart the actual spoken word that's within a podcast. So up until now, podcast has just been this recorded audio or video. And if you want to search any of the stuff that we're talking about, like, that's impossible. It's just search for the name of the podcast or the people on it and pull it. But
machine learning.
They've spent all this time doing transcripts on YouTube. If you go to YouTube now, everything's like automatically transcribed now, and it's really good.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you guys remember when we were surprised by this in Google Voice? Sorry,
I'm just going to say that was a part of the reason why we ended up having a YouTube channel versus podcast. I feel like the way people consume the two are very different, and podcast is kind of something that's off the side. You know, you listen to it in the car, and then you forgot about it. You will not go rate it or share it or actually click on the links that was mentioned, because you cannot click it. You're in the car.
It's like radio.
Right. Yeah, versus when we have a YouTube channel, then we can put in the show note and you're watching it and the show note's right there, so you can actually follow up, and so you will. So I feel like I'm not sure if this is going to change that dynamic, but it's very different.
Yeah, it would certainly help it. They're talking about possibly including traditional podcast app features. Like, I guess what I'm wondering, like, in tying this in with the rumor that we talked about, well, just a few minutes ago, right before the break, and then in more detail last week from Droid Life about Google Play Music going away in lieu of YouTube, is this all happening at the same time for a reason?
Yes.
Is Play Music and the de-emphasis on Play Music still a rumor, by the way, but I mean, that's currently where Google's podcast effort resides. And if that's going away, Google refocuses on something new. Do they refocus on a new podcast app, or is this entirely search-based?
Yeah, and I think you could be onto something, but I think it's generous to say that their podcast effort exists within Google Play Music. They added podcasts and then walked away from it.
Yeah.
They haven't really done anything to help it, much like Apple. I mean, as a podcaster, with Apple being one of the biggest source of podcast listeners, it's amazing how little Apple has done for podcasts in the span of 10 years. I mean, very little. Only until recently did they start waking up to it, and that's only for current iOS users. It doesn't help, down the line, but that's another discussion for another time. But the timing of this could be really interesting and maybe revealed at Google I/O in terms of what the future of YouTube Music and Google Play Music, and if Google Play Music then becomes a relic, what happens to the podcast aspect? We a couple of weeks ago we talked about how they were integrating podcasts into the search app. Remember, and they were kind of doing a more deeper kind of integration there, making it more natural to just the phone experience. But I think if they come out with podcast player like functionality, if they come out with an actual app, or just figure out how to make it native to the phone, I mean, if I'm Pocket Casts, if I'm Dogcatcher, if I'm all those Castbox, all the like Android is great because there's this whole breeding ground of podcast apps out there that are options out there because there's no iTunes for Google for Android users. If Google steps in and does that, that's going to be huge for podcasters because it could increase their reach. As somebody who produces podcasts at a corporate level, it's very difficult to drive a subscribe button because it's iTunes and then a list of everything else.
Yes.
But if you just have that one Google link, that will be a lot easier, but it will also potentially decimate the player, the podcast player app field on the Android side. So we got to watch this one very closely because it's in the nature of what we do. But it's going to be very interesting if this whole deep dive is true.
Mm-hmm. I do want to. I do feel like iTunes also, like just Apple has a better way of editorializing what's going on in iTunes. Like when you go to iTunes, it is a portal to all this entertainment that's offered on your iOS device. And what I have seen Apple do over the years is that they will spotlight like podcasts and podcast hosts and things like that. And I don't see a lot of that. I see spotlight. But it's different.
They do it for apps, though.
They do it for apps.
Right,
they do a great job like with games. They do a great job with like a lot of the apps centered around like the best developed apps. You know, we have the Google Play Awards and all that. But when it comes to content is, I feel like there's a silo between the way like YouTube does content. It's so good at content and like the algorithm is there versus the way Google gives you content on Android and like other Google services. It's just a very different, there's a disparity. And I think that's why just shoving it into YouTube, putting it over there where the resources already are makes a lot more sense.
Do you think podcasts end up in YouTube also?
Well, I don't,
because I mean that's kind of tied together by what you're saying.
Yeah.
That it's really
speech.
It's that expanded kind of extra interactive content.
Actually, I mean,
which is what podcast lacks.
Yeah, well, one very small thing I would like to see. Well, small. I mean, it's not that so clearly. It's difficult to do, but I would like if I hear something either on a podcast or on a radio show, and I want to share it, even like in a tweet or something. Like I don't right now have a good way to do it because. Right, exactly. Because right now I have to be like scrambling and writing it down and then typing it all out. It's like sketchnoting, I guess.
I use a screen recorder sometimes.
Oh, all right.
And so I'll like record the bit for like a friend, like if I'm listening to my self-help podcasts. And so I'll like send it to my friends on Instagram. But like I have to manually do that.
That's a hard
if you listen to like an hour-long podcast and at I don't know, minute 35, there was this one tip that can help you make sure your succulents don't die, which is a problem for me right now. I don't know how to take care of my succulents. Actually, it didn't die. It just grow tall and never actually grow big. Anyway, sorry. Not the point. The point is, if someone have listened to something like that and wanted to point me to it, it's a lot of work to figure out which minute mark you are at. Yeah. Because you just listen to it. And really for an hour long, we humans don't have a good sense of where things are. So if something's just that, either maybe they auto-transcribe it so that then at least I can find the show and I search succulent and then I can jump right in, or when whoever's listening to, they can click the share button and then it generates a link. Well, that would be wonderful.
And I mean, that's part of what they're kind of alluding to here. If you have that deep understanding of what every one of us is saying inside the podcast and that becomes searchable.
Right.
Think about you do a search for some particular topic that we talk about on this show. Somebody goes to Google and does a search for that. Not only does it pull back the show, it also knows where inside that show we talk about it. You click it, you jump right to that point in our show. Like that's amazing for discovery.
They don't do it for YouTube yet. So
if they aren't doing
I should not be too hopeful.
Right. That's a really good point.
Because they already do transcript.
That's a very good point.
Right?
That's a really good point.
So maybe I should hope for YouTube first and then podcast.
Well, I mean, what I think will be interesting to that point is that you got to imagine that they're positioning YouTube as their media delivery engine, right? And that it's not so much that it's video, it's just a media file. So I wonder if they pump a lot of this into whatever the new YouTube is, and that becomes the new entertainment platform. I don't know.
Right,
so,
right.
Time will tell. We'll find out.
It is called YouTube. YouTube it in.
Although if it does happen for this show, what would be the first thing you would search for? Would it?
Oh man, what would people?
Goats.
Yeah, goats.
I mean,
What about holy cow?
Possibly holy cow. Although it has its own it has its own results on YouTube already. So
true.
Google Glass, holy
Google
cow.
Glass, there you go.
Yeah, no.